Hi, I'm Allison Pease, Associate to the Provost for Faculty at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. At the Teaching and Learning Center, we're starting a new series of podcasts called TLC Spotlights, in which we feature one or several faculty and staff members who have expertise in a certain area of benefit to the John Jay teaching community. In today's Spotlight podcast, I interviewed Gina Foster, Director of the Teaching and Learning Center since 2016. Dr. Foster holds a number of advanced degrees, as you'll hear in my interview, and has training and work experience in trauma and resiliency. In this interview, I ask her about her background and how it led to her work in teaching and learning, as well as the work of trauma victims from around the world. Through much of the discussion, I return to this question: how can understanding trauma and resilience make us better teachers at John Jay? So you have an MFA in creative writing, an MA in religion, a PhD in philosophy, art, and critical thought, and you are certified in international trauma studies. What is the through line in these studies as you understand it, and how has that led you to your current career directing teaching and learning centers?
That's a great question, and there's not a single answer because for graduate degrees, you tend to think someone can't make up her mind, but there are threads, and there are threads. In philosophy, my focus is on ontological ethics and aesthetics. And if you focus on ontological, it's about being and becoming. What does it mean to be and become? And to understand being and becoming requires not simply self-reflection and study of how others have approached those words and those themes, but also the enactment and the manifestation and the sharing of these things. And in my life, service and education have been very important in my family and the culture I came from. And in my life, being a creative person and being a thoughtful person, as well as being someone devoted to exploring what justice means and how to correct the wounds that justice and injustice invariably commit. These things have all been incredibly important to me, and they've intersected. And if you read my poetry, you will see a great deal of wounding and healing in conversation, and the same in terms of the topics I've chosen in philosophy. And the approach I choose in education is one of holistic, responsive teaching, and it's invariably with students who are not privileged in the sense that we think of privileged. They are struggling with economic oppression, with racist oppression, with gender oppressions, with sexual assault oppressions, and they're struggling with their own mental health issues. And all of those come together in communities that respond well to an ontological ethics and an ontological aesthetics, and communities that create these things.
I want to talk about trauma and use your expertise in trauma to help us think through how we can be helping students learn at John Jay. Your work in trauma studies led you to understand CUNY students' needs, and I say CUNY because you've also been at Lehman in addition to John Jay. CUNY students' needs differently than some of the standard approaches to teaching and learning. As someone who understands trauma, what do you see in our students, and how did that shape your approach to teaching and learning?
Yes. Again, great question. And let's frame this with the understanding that I'm not a native New Yorker or an East Coaster, that I spent most of my childhood in Southern California, and that I've worked with different communities who are responding to traumatic events and shared experiences such as domestic violence survivors, sexual assault survivors, refugees, children in at-risk neighborhoods, in halfway houses, and I bring these kinds of experiences as well as my own experiences of trauma to all the education I do, and I have for the last, say, 25 years. So arriving at CUNY in 2007, I already had a mindset that the students were likely to be experiencing traumas in their lives, just by the nature of being in college, in public urban environments, by the nature of being in diverse groups that weren't being, overly funded, overly privileged, overly blessed and protected, that these students were going to be needing what I would think of as holistic responses to trauma.
And can you help unpack that a little bit for me? For those of us who aren't experts in trauma, can you explain what it is, what it looks like, and some of the things that we might need to be aware of to change the way we approach our classes?
So I think it's important to understand that when I say trauma, I don't mean something that is limiting someone by nature of their identity. I mean something that is limiting how one develops. And it's not a choice on the part of that person. These are circumstantial activities, effects, influences that actually prevent someone from becoming the most they can be at that particular moment. So when I'm looking at trauma, I'm thinking of something that disrupts our identity. It disrupts the consistency of who we are. It's that wound that either never heals or is extremely difficult to heal without outside interventions. And it moves us off course, knocks us off course, and it's not a simple bruise. It's not a simple interruption to how we're learning or saying, I can't do this, it's too hard. It's, I don't know how to face this given who I am, because who I was yesterday is not who I am today.
In thinking about our students, I think I'm confused maybe about the difference between overly stressed students, and I would say there probably isn't a John Jay student who isn't under immense stresses, right, environmental, structural, etc., versus trauma. Do you make a distinction here?
I make a distinction between a person who is traumatized and needs external assistance to recover and someone who is experiencing normal stressors that kick us off base from time to time, but we can recover. But what we really want to think about with our students here is not so much what individually each is experiencing and whether or not that's severe trauma or something that's ordinary and can be pulled back in without much of our help. We want to think about learning, how learning is traumatic. Learning is disruptive to our sense of who we are. And if learning is happening in an environment and a set of circumstances that probably include multiple traumas, and we've just listed them. Our John Jay students are working full-time and going to school. They are often raising families on their own. They are dealing with racism, many of them. They are dealing with sexism. They are dealing with gender oppression. And we can go on and on and on, mental health issues. But think about learning in that context. Learning from day to day is asking us to become someone we weren't the day before. And depending on how much learning we're asking them to do and how far it is from who they were and understood themselves to be the day before, we're asking them perhaps to be more resilient than they may be.
Right. Now, in some of the things that you've written, you've talked about a difference, right? Now, you're talking about our students in a way that feels very familiar to me, but I think there's a difference in the perception, right? There are those who have the outlook that these are our students, but somehow with that comes a sense, and therefore they can't achieve X. right? But you have a mindset that you call capacities in development, right? So can you explain what the distinction that you are making there is between those who can see, students can't do this versus we have capacities in development, and how we can begin to start to shift our mindset so that we understand our teaching as developing capacities?
Capacity is one of my favorite concepts. Because for me, capacity is not fixed. Capacity indicates a certain set of limitations that we live in at any given moment. And as we develop ourselves, our skills, our knowledge, our experiences, we reach the limits of those capacities. Now, if we really reach the limits of those capacities break, they burst, and we are in a new set of capacities. And to me, that is what learning is all about. Think of it as bubbles. You can talk to your students about capacity and learning as a bubble. Right now, the limits of what you can do based on what you currently know and have done and have demonstrated are probably about here. If we keep developing those to the best we can, you're going to break through that and you'll be in the next step. So this is the development of critical thinking. This is the development of deep knowledge. This is the development of working memory.
And when you are doing it right, I imagine you create some resistance from students, right? I'm hearing this, I'm thinking most of us don't want to change. We're inherently conservative beings, right? You come to school theoretically to change, but once someone starts actually forcing you to do so, it can be very painful and threatening. How do you deal with resistance?
So instead of forcing my students to do things, right? You thought I would not pick up on that word.
I never do, of course.
But we can be perhaps overly eager or assertive, shall we say.
Okay.
But we're challenging our students. We're motivating them. This is where motivation is so important. We are believing in them and modeling for them and mirroring for them that we believe they can do it. And they may not be able to burst a single set of capacities or multiple ones in our class, but they'll get closer. And then in the next class, they get there. But if we think, well, if they can't do it now, they're never going to do it, they give up on themselves already. So we have to be mirroring to them that we think they can do it. We have to be realistic about where they're starting so that we can help them move step by step into expanding their capacities. We really have to do that, which means we have to be very present and very aware that it's not easy, that it doesn't happen in isolation, that each student will do it at their own pace, and yet there are certain consistencies, there are certain things we can do that have very high rates of success. And when students start to feel that they are expanding capacity, they are far more likely to keep doing it. It's so exciting to be able to do something you couldn't do the day before or 2 weeks before. Getting there is tough. We become guides then. We become the cheerleaders, the mentors, all of these things. And we also become the realistic reflectors. Here's where you are. Let's stop. You just fell down. Okay, take 5 minutes and feel bad. Now get up and try again.
In helping our faculty understand how knowing about trauma and resiliency can make you a better teacher, you have published some of your research on this, and you have organized it around 2 models, the STAR model and resiliency principles. This is going to be a lot for our listeners to absorb, so I want to take each concept separately and ask you to sort of walk us through how each of these ideas can shape our approach to teaching. So the STAR model, can you tell us what it is and how can it help shape individual faculty members' approach to how they teach?
So the STAR model is really a way of helping students and your mentees master some of the basic life skills they need to get through their education and to get through their early professional lives. Time management, for example, comes up frequently. And many of us are not good ourselves at time management, but helping our students understand the time that's needed for each activity that's on the syllabus so they can anticipate and plan ahead, asking them to think about different kinds of time, right? There's fixed time and there's more fluid time. There's time that cannot be replaced. You must do this every day at such and such a time. And there's time that's more fluid. Well, I could sleep a little less or a little more. I can move my meal times around. Okay. Class time is fixed. And you start helping students understand that time is not an enemy and that time can actually not just be measured, time can be categorized, time can be compartmentalized. And the whole STAR model is about compartmentalizing and attaching these different skills and concepts to actual activities. So we have goals, time, processes, communication, and resources. How many of our students know how to identify the resources they need for a given task and to use them appropriately? How many of our students are we encouraging to identify gaps in resources that they need and create them, find them, making it work? Again, we're not working with students who are in privileged environments because John Jay is not a privileged environment for the most part. So where do we find what we need? How do we make it work? What do we do that's creative to problem solve? There are different kinds of communication. How do you email your professor? What kind of language do you use? What kind of language do you use in discussion in the classroom with your peers? What's the language we use in a formal presentation or paper? These are all different. Emails, phone calls, chats, emojis, right? These are all different. And when are they appropriate and when are they not appropriate? Processes, what is a process? Are you looking at a process that's circular or linear? Are you looking at a process that takes a great deal of time or takes very little time and you start to combine things? Are you looking at processes that require higher level orders of thinking, are physical, are emotional, are thought experiments? What is it that needs to happen for this project? If you're doing a project that requires scaffolding and teamwork, well, you can ask your students to look at the different steps of the project, the different people who will be involved, the kinds of work that take place at each part, how much time is involved, what resources they need, and then goals. How do we set priorities? How do we measure where we are in achieving our goals? How do we go back and revise our goals? And how do we know when we're done and we set new goals? And yes, faculty, this is assessment and closing the loop, and it's painful for many of us, so have some empathy. But this is really what we want our students to learn. And we're going to start with a project at any point, probably, where one of these is fixed. So if the amount of time is fixed, we start with time, and then we move to what are the goals for that time. If we have resources, what do these resources allow us to do? Well, then the resources connect to processes, connect to goals, time, and communication. It's really fun for students. They pick this up very fast. They tend to pick this up faster than faculty because faculty tend to think this is fairly simplistic. And it is, but that's the point, because it's giving your students a way to categorize and tag what they're doing. And if you do this with your syllabus in the first week of class and have your students tag it, you'll be amazed at how compliance leaps.
Interesting. And I just want to point out for listeners that if you look up Dr. Foster's article, you will see that this is a physical model, a 5-pointed star. And at each point of the star, you have goals, time, communication, processes, and resources. Right? Makes sense. resiliency principles. Can you explain what those are? And resiliency strikes me as a term that very closely connected to trauma, so maybe you want to explain the link there and then explain what the resiliency principles are.
Right. So trauma and resiliency are often linked, particularly in that field of study. And resiliency, or resilience, and you'll see it both ways, is usually defined as the state of being able to recover one's original state. If you press into a rubber ball, it will come back to a smooth surface. It will recover its original state, right?
Very resilient.
Water, in its fluid state, is resilient. Water in its frozen state is not, and water in its vaporous state, well, it's very hard to measure whether it's coming back or not, right? How do you disrupt that? But resiliency is that ability to recover who you were before. And that's what's so important about working with anyone in the world right now as an individual and any community or large group, identifying as a large group, because how do you live in this world and not be traumatized? Right? How does that happen? So how do we help ourselves recover? Now, the research on complex PTSD and PTSD survivors tells us that we begin with stability and that we can't really begin healing work unless the person feels safe and feels stable. And stability is also interpreted to be consistency of identity, which I've referred to before. It's that sense that I'm the same person today that I was yesterday, and that I'll be that person tomorrow. It's not a sense that I'm exactly the same. It's the sense that I'm Gina today, I was Gina yesterday, I'll be Gina tomorrow. And even if something terrible happens and my sense of safety in the world is disrupted, I still know that I am that Gina, right? So once we have stability, we feel safe enough to start facing what it was that hurt us, what it was that changed us, and that's where we hit capacity, because our capacities need to be redeveloped. Right? We lose capacity when we're traumatized. We go into survival mode. And in survival mode, we draw back into the most essential parts of our identities. And this is true of large groups as well. So we need to then develop capacities again for communicating, for thinking, for being in the world, and for being effective in the world. When we develop capacity, which we've talked about to some extent, then we have to think about whether or not we can adapt to all the other people in the world and situations that are developing their capacities, right, that are attempting to be resilient or not. And that's where flexibility comes in. And we need to be able to adapt to changes in circumstances, expected and unexpected. We need to learn not to be too flexible, hypermobile, because if we're hypermobile, then we don't get anything done, right? We can't stand up on our own 2 feet or from whatever place of stability we have. And if we're not flexible enough, we end up breaking. Once we're able to go through those 3 levels of resiliency, development, so stability, capacity, and flexibility, then we can be productive members of a community. And in a community, we share goals, time, resources, processes, and communication, one or any combination of those that bring us together. And we need to be able to be flexible, adapt. We need to be able to contribute to the capacity development of the community and others, as well as having that be part of our own development. And we need to be able to help keep that community stable. But if we don't have those connections with community, right, then again, we become isolated and our sense of self becomes usually fairly stratified, and that's not helpful. And I'm kind of pushing this to say classrooms and online classrooms are communities, and we are in community with our students. We need to understand that community is something we can support and develop to the extent that we are willing to engage that, so that our students can be resilient and can learn better because they are learning in community whether or not we're addressing that.
I think I need you to explain this more, because I think when I hear a lot of people talk about building a community in the classroom, they're talking on a different plane, right? About like, well, let's break the ice, let's put people in groups and then have them come back and report out to people. What are you talking about when you're talking about this?
So
the resiliency principles and the notion that you have these individuals and then you're building a community from it.
Breaking the ice is a term that
just like it, I can tell
bothers me and has just it's just gets me for decades.
Tell me why.
Because it's a violent metaphor. It's not a community metaphor. It's not about connecting. It's not about learning together, doing together, learning from each other, challenging each other. It's breaking. It's breaking ice.
Okay.
Well, people are not ice, and relationships are not ice. They just aren't.
So how should it be done?
So how should it be done? Because I'm not at all passionate about this, right? But we need to see our students as people. My father used to remind me when he was practicing medicine that the first rule of medicine, when in doubt, look at the patient. And I want to tell all the faculty everywhere, people who are educating or interested in mentoring, when in doubt, look at your student who is standing in front of you, right? And then look at your classroom and get them to talk to each other. How many of your students know each other's names, and how often do you ask them to do that? If you're at the point where you make yourself memorize their names, have you reached the point of challenging them to know each other, to speak to each other by name? Do you know what that does?
What does it do?
Students came to me years after taking a Comp 2 class in Oregon to tell me it was their favorite class and it was the only class where they felt recognized and where they felt comfortable and that they were seen and supported and could do the work.
I see. Okay, so what you're saying is that it's not just the instructor, but when the community is recognizing you, it's giving you the conditions of stability so that you can develop capacity?
Yes. And
okay. That was not a preformed performative. I am just clicking right now.
Now you're clicking, and remember, it's not all about you as the instructor.
Oh, stop.
Right? And, I like to perform, and so I would want it to be about me sometimes, but it's not. It's about the community, and it's also not all about the students. It's all about us together. In the classroom, we are sharing time. In the classroom, we are sharing learning objectives, goals. We are sharing processes. We are sharing communication, and we are definitely sharing resources. Now, if we're sharing all of those things and we're going to manage them effectively, we need to recognize each other and find ways to practice working with each of those, singly and together, so that the capacity that we're developing really hits those learning objectives, really hits the departmental objectives for students in these courses, and also, most of all, supports the student's sense that they're learning.
More about how you can help make a student aware of their learning, right? I do think that has to be the key part, right? But supporting the student's sense of their learning is different, I think, than helping students to become metacognitively aware. I am learning.
So how do we help students understand that they're learning or sense that they're learning? One thing we do is ask them, what are you learning? Another thing we do is get specific. We covered this concept today. We were talking about, let's say, sonnets, since I'm a poet, right? And I was talking about masculine and feminine endings. Can you show me some? That's great. Can you explain to me why those are masculine and feminine endings? Wonderful. Can you tell that to the class? Okay. So, do you feel you understand this? Can you do that on an exam? Can you do this in a paper? No. It is not something that you can say, I definitively know that student is learning because I've measured it, but I've quantitatively measured it, and I've gotten the student's mind that they're learning something.
Right. Okay, I want to go back to resiliency principles, and I want to make sure I'm understanding their application.
Yeah.
Right? So on the one hand, it is about establishing, I think, a classroom community. What else is it about?
So let's talk about something that is affecting our whole community, and it's a trauma that's affecting our community. We're dealing with the loss of one of our students, and we don't, on the whole, know much about what took place or why, and we know that these are incidents that happen. Many of us have lost friends and family to these kinds of decisions and these kind of actions. We are here together sharing these senses of loss and grief, and sometimes anger, and sometimes frustration, anxiety. There's so many emotions that come up. And what do we do with that? And how do we face our students on the first day of classes, knowing many of them are also feeling these things? Well, we let people know that we have a counseling center. We give them information about resources. We also think about what happens in resiliency and what's the first level of resiliency as I understand it. It's stability. So we provide safe spaces. We provide consistent spaces. We provide meaningful work that the students can see is actually speaking to a learning objective, right? We don't have to talk directly about what happened unless we feel with our students that's appropriate. But we can be respectful of what our students are feeling and give them practical things to do, meaningful things to do. And we can also remember this concept of the class as community. And at times like this, we mourn together. So we come together in community. So again, having your students recognize each other by name and know something about each other supports us. When I was in college, and especially toward the end of college, I had very strong emotions, as did most of my peers, and I didn't have places to put them. There were people to talk to occasionally, but I didn't have a history or a track record of having gotten through very difficult things and knowing I could do it again. I'd gone through some things, and they were tough, but I hadn't kind of learned to trust myself as an adult outside of my family, right, or as an adult member of the family, in getting through the hard things, surviving them, even if it took time. It took me much more time and many more experiences before I could face difficult things and think to myself, this is really hard, but I did that, so I know that somewhere in me I have what it takes to get through this. Well, I'm assuming that our students have some similarities with that, and that even if they have gone through very difficult times, and many of them have, that sense of trust in themselves as problem solvers and survivors is perhaps not as strong as it could be. So what we can do to help them develop that sense of, I can persist, I can solve problems, and I can create community wherever I am to get me through, then we are likely to experience fewer of these losses. And we're likely to recognize students on the way to those losses faster. We talk about grit in more recent research on resilience. And grit is the sort of the quality of what keeps you going. But grit apparently is not something that can be changed in terms of how much you have from person to person. It's not like capacity. It is something that you can maximize. So it's somewhat like IQ. Someone can measure IQ, but the IQ of two people can be 20 points apart, and the person with the lower IQ is outperforming the person with the higher IQ, right? So these things give me hope. And the fact that I'm here at John Jay gives me hope because I found a place where I can use much of my training and who I am to be with the faculty and students and staff here. And I can share that there's a great deal of joy in the journey, and there's a great deal of humor, and there's so much meaning. And we can't rescue each other, but we can be there for each other and get each other through. And we can't rescue our students, but we can be there for them. We can support them, and we can help them get through. And that is something that, at the end of the day, makes for a very good homecoming. And it makes for a very good entry into the next day. And that's continuity, and that persists.
We've been talking a lot about student success at John Jay this year. And we've been talking about how many of our students drop out. They leave. Despite their coming here. They want to be here.
Mm-hmm.
You have suggested that one of the reasons that students may leave is because of a mismatch in perception between faculty and students.
Mm-hmm.
Do you want to say more about that?
Let's go back to some comments you've made about faculty thinking students just can't make it, or they don't really belong here, or this is the not the right fit. And it goes back to that idea of where are our students starting when they show up, and are we really seeing them there and honoring that? Are we punishing our students with deficit-based thinking, saying they don't have these skills, whoever they are, but saying we want to see these skills, we don't see these skills. We want to see this knowledge, we don't see this knowledge. Or in the first 3 terms, we're not seeing the transfer of knowledge, they're not sustaining it, right? Are we being punitive? Are we not looking? Are we not seeing? Are we not valuing? And I think that from the beginning, honoring our students, respecting our students, liking them and appreciating them. We have to like people to be in this business. Individual, occasionally, we may not work out so well, but on the whole, they're human beings and they came here. And if they're really not ready to be in this class, interventions are needed, and we have interventions. We have people to talk to. If we have a whole class and they're not where you think they should be to be in the class, then maybe we need to think about the class, and maybe we need to think about how we talk to the students about expectations and see how we negotiate that. A syllabus is a legal document, but how you manifest, demonstrate, enact your syllabus, that's negotiable. That's very negotiable. And if you have in your mind what your capacity development is going to be, ideally, and you have in your mind that you're going to check and see where your students are and if you think you can get them there. Can you all get there? Can some of you get there? Then you can have more interesting conversations, and you're going to lose fewer students. But I'm telling you, knowing your students' names and having them know each other's names, you're going to lose fewer of them because they feel seen and they feel connected. And if they don't feel seen and connected, why should they come back?
I'm going to ask you the same question that I've asked each of the Distinguished Teaching Prize winners that I've interviewed. And that is, for faculty who want to make a small change to their teaching, what is one small change that you think all of us could do that would help students learn more?
Let's go back to what we were just saying. Ask your students to learn each other's names. Do it in a way that really engages them and makes them look at each other. So they're not all looking straight forward. If you're in a classroom, you rearrange the classroom best you can so that they can see each other. And if you're online, there are either photos or some sort of image, some visual that represents the students so that they actually start looking at those and knowing not just by the written name, but by that representation. I would do that before I would do anything pedagogical.
Gina Foster, Director of the Teaching and Learning Center at John Jay College, thank you for your time.
Thank you.